On a freezing March morning in 2008, the world's financial heart began to seize. Panic exploded across Bear Stearns' trading floor. Phones shrieked, terminals blinked red, and grown men cursed at numbers spiraling into oblivion. "Bear's collapsing," someone muttered, as screens flashed a horrifying truth. Liquidity gone. At JPMorgan Chase's headquarters, Jamie Dimon stood in a high-rise office, coffee cooling in his hand, watching the red tide flood Wall Street. The Federal Reserve had already called. "You're the only one who can absorb them," they said. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a lifeline thrown by the government. Dimon narrowed his eyes. This wasn't salvation. It was power. "We'll do it for $2 a share," he said coldly. Behind him, a storm built over Manhattan, but inside, he was calm. If Bear fell uncontrolled, the dominoes wouldn't stop. Today, Jamie Dimon wasn't just saving a bank. He was anchoring the global economy, with his hand on the wheel and the market by the throat. As the ink dried on the Bear Stearns acquisition, Wall Street's biggest players whispered in disbelief. $2, someone gasped. It was theft in the open. But Jamie Dimon wasn't interested in optics. He was interested in survival. Not just JPMorgan's, but the system's. In a black SUV outside the Fed's New York branch, Dimon sat in silence, a stack of legal pads on his lap. His lawyers argued about indemnity clauses. He listened to none of it. His eyes stared ahead, calculating. "They'll come for Lehman next," he muttered. He was right. The banks were bleeding internally, and the government was out of tools. It was all backroom handshakes, late-night war rooms, and Jamie in the middle. A field general, not a suit. He wasn't saving Wall Street out of kindness. He was protecting the empire he helped build. The dominoes were falling, but he intended to be the last one standing. The days that followed were a blur of legal maneuvering, midnight conference calls, and strategic containment. Jamie's staff watched him sleep only 3 hours a night. Still, he moved with controlled fury. "They'll blame us when this turns," he warned. And he was right again. Politicians began sharpening their knives. Bankers were villains, and Dimon, despite playing savior, was in the crosshairs. On live television, he calmly told Congress, "We didn't cause the crisis, but we're cleaning it up." The statement echoed across networks. Some called him a liar. Others saw a leader among cowards. Inside JPMorgan, tension rose. He wasn't just managing capital, he was managing perception. And perception was power. Every step he took was calculated. Every word weighed like gold. He was no longer just a CEO. He was the face of American finance. In private, Jamie confided to his wife Judith, "I didn't want this crown, but no one else would wear it." Their Upper East Side apartment was quiet that night, insulated from the chaos outside. But his mind remained at war. He reread crisis memos like a general reviewing battlefield maps. Not out of paranoia, but precision. Across the city, job cuts mounted. Homes foreclosed. Anger simmered in the streets. Protesters held up signs with his name, scrawled in blood red. Yet Jamie remained untouched, unmoved, unflinching. He had faced down collapse and won. But in doing so, he had inherited something darker, public rage. And with that rage, a question. Was he a savior? Or a symbol of everything that broke? As the quarter ended, JPMorgan emerged stronger than ever. While others drowned, Dimon's ship sailed forward, sleek, prepared, dominant. CNBC crowned him King of Wall Street. But in Jamie's eyes, it was far from over. "The next hit's coming," he told his team. "It always comes." He walked the 40th floor alone, passing framed headlines of past victories. But they didn't move him. What mattered now was control. Not just of markets, but of narrative. Dimon knew reputation was currency, and he intended to trade it with brutal efficiency. As sirens echoed faintly below, he stood at the window, watching the skyline pulse with fading light. The storm had passed, but another brewed just beyond the horizon. Long before headlines crowned him, Jamie Dimon was just a boy in Queens, sharp, driven, and hungry for more. His father, Theodore Dimon, worked on Wall Street as a stockbroker. Jamie would sit in his father's home office, quietly absorbing every trade, every tense phone call. One night, when Jamie was 12, his father slammed the receiver and muttered, "They don't care how smart you are, just how much you make them." That line etched itself into Jamie's psyche like a brand. It wasn't bitterness, it was a lesson. At Harvard Business School, Jamie outworked everyone, slept 3 hours a night, memorized financial systems like scripture. He wasn't chasing wealth. He was chasing command. But even at 25, he carried a chip on his shoulder. A need to prove, to others, but mostly to himself, that he wasn't just a smart kid from Queens. He was a force the world had no choice but to reckon with. At Harvard, Jamie Dimon didn't party. He dissected companies. In lectures he challenged professors, sometimes too sharply. "You're wrong on the data," he once said, mid-class to a stunned silence. But Jamie didn't crave attention. He craved clarity. Numbers were language. Patterns were code. And he could see them before anyone else. Still, he wasn't alone. There was one man he admired, Sandy Weil, the scrappy CEO who had built empires from nothing. When Weil offered him a job postdumba, Jamie took it without pause. It wasn't just a job, it was mentorship, a father figure in capitalism's rawest form. For years they were inseparable, turning commercial credit into Citigroup. Until ego shattered everything. Weil forced him out in 1998, Tata and Kais. Betrayed, Dimon vanished for over a year. No interviews. No deals. Just silence. But in that silence, something hardened. The boy from Queens was gone. What returned was colder, smarter, and far more dangerous. When Jamie was pushed out of Citigroup, it wasn't just a corporate exile, it was personal. Sandy had been family. The betrayal scorched him. Colleagues whispered that he was done, too intense, too ruthless to lead again. But Jamie wasn't finished. He waited, watched, and when Bank One came calling, he answered. It was a mess, bloated, broken, forgettable. But that's where Jamie thrived. In rot, he saw rebirth. He cleaned house with surgical precision, axed waste, rewired culture, and within 2 years doubled its value. When JPMorgan merged with Bank One in 2004, Jamie walked into its fortress with fire in his chest. A second chance. No. This was vengeance executed with polish. "They thought I'd fade," he later said. They were wrong. In every boardroom, every earnings call, he stood taller, not to be noticed, but to dominate. He wasn't seeking acceptance anymore. He was building a throne. At home, Jamie was a paradox. To his wife, Judith, and their 3 daughters, he was patient, grounded, even gentle. He made time for dinners, for quiet nights, for the rare walk in Central Park. But the fire never dimmed. He'd leave a ballet recital to take a midnight call. Miss holidays to broker a deal. "I love you," he'd tell his daughters, but the world doesn't wait. They didn't resent it. They understood it. Because to Jamie, family wasn't separate from mission, it was why the mission mattered. The world saw a shark in a suit. His family saw the boy from Queens who still felt the weight of his father's words. That balance, between love and empire, never came easy. But every time he walked through the door, loosened his tie, and kissed his wife's forehead, he reminded himself, you can win everything and still lose what counts. He intended never to forget that. Behind closed doors, Jamie often reflected aloud, if I hadn't been fired, I wouldn't be here. It wasn't just rhetoric. Failure was his crucible. He kept a photo of Sandy Weil, framed, untouched, in a drawer. A reminder. Not of betrayal, but rebirth. Friends noticed he rarely celebrated wins. Next quarter, he'd say. Always forward. Never satisfied. In therapy, he once confessed, "I don't know how to stop." Not as weakness, but as confession. Jamie wasn't addicted to money. He was addicted to momentum. The next fight. The next storm. The next rescue. To stay still was to sink. And so he didn't. He read more than anyone, met with rivals, mentored analysts, visited branches in person. "You'll never outwork me," he often told new recruits. It wasn't a threat. It was his truth. Jamie Dimon wasn't built to rest. He was built to move. And when he moved, so did the financial world. By 2010, Jamie Dimon stood alone atop the financial world. JPMorgan had survived the crash, outplayed its rivals, and collected assets like war trophies. But the spotlight had turned searing. Regulators circled. Senators sharpened their sound bites. They didn't want stability, they wanted blood. And Jamie? He wouldn't kneel. "We followed the rules. Don't punish us for surviving," he told CNBC. But it wasn't just Capitol Hill gunning for him. Inside JP Morgan, whispers grew. Senior execs felt stifled, talent lost to burnout, vision blurred by control. Dimon had centralized power so tightly that nothing moved without his nod. "Jamie's the sun," one insider said. "Everything else orbits, or burns." And then came the first crack. A trader in London. Complex derivatives. Swelling positions. Risk masked in jargon. Jamie brushed it off publicly as a tempest in a teapot. It wasn't. It was a time bomb. And it had already started ticking. The trader's name was Bruno Ixel, but the world would come to know him as the London Whale. His trades were enormous, almost surreal in scale. At first, they showed profit. Then, losses. Dimon received a memo, warnings about exposure, volatility. He dismissed them. "Our risk controls are sound," he told the board. But the truth? He didn't want more fire in the press. JP Morgan was supposed to be the fortress. And fortresses didn't leak. Yet behind the curtain, internal auditors panicked. Emails flagged inconsistencies. Executives tiptoed around the truth, hoping it would pass. It didn't. Losses ballooned into billions. Jamie stood in front of shareholders, jaw locked, and said, "We made a terrible mistake. I was dead wrong." For a man who controlled every word, the confession hit like a shot. He wasn't just wrong, he was exposed. And Wall Street smelled blood in the water. The fallout was brutal. Congress summoned Jamie again, but this time, it wasn't praise. It was prosecution. Senator Elizabeth Warren grilled him on oversight. "How does a $6 billion loss go unnoticed?" she asked. Jamie answered calmly, but his eyes burned. "We made mistakes, we fixed them." The exchange went viral. King Jamie dethroned, headlines teased. Yet even in the lion's den, Dimon didn't flinch. Inside, though, he seethed. Trust was broken. His fortress had cracks. He fired top lieutenants, reshuffled risk teams, installed surveillance on departments that had once reported directly to him. "Never again," he muttered in a closed-door meeting. To win back the market, he didn't just promise change, he enforced it with military precision. The Jamie who emerged wasn't softer. He was sharper, colder, and far more dangerous. He had tasted public shame, and vowed never to taste it again. But even as he rebuilt, shadows gathered elsewhere. Cyber attacks, lawsuits, employee leaks. A data breach struck in 2014, names, numbers, access points all stolen. Jamie was furious. "We run the most secure systems in the world," he barked. But the truth stung. JPMorgan, the untouchable citadel, had been breached by faceless intruders. The attack was traced to Russian operatives. Washington panicked. Jamie went to Capitol Hill, not as a banker, but as a defender of national infrastructure. "This isn't just a bank problem," he warned Congress. "This is economic warfare." His voice was grave, his tone relentless. And behind closed doors, the CIA listened. He wasn't just managing portfolios anymore. He was embedded in national security. One slip in the code, and markets could fall like towers. It was no longer about bonuses or press. It was about survival, in a new kind of war. In the silence of his office, Jamie watched footage of JPMorgan's systems under siege. Firewalls breached. Code rewritten in milliseconds. He stared not at the data, but the implication. Finance was no longer numbers on a ledger. It was digital warfare. His phone buzzed. Another subpoena. Another headline. He took a breath. "We'll keep standing," he whispered. And he meant it. That year, JPMorgan doubled cybersecurity budgets. He hired ex-military cyber operatives. Installed biometric security. His team joked the 40th floor was becoming NORAD. But Jamie wasn't laughing. Every day was now a preemptive strike. And as he watched the skyline from his office, steel, glass, and vulnerability, he knew the threats would keep coming. Financial, political, digital. The battlefield had changed. But so had he. The fire in his chest wasn't dimming. It was evolving. In 2016, while preparing for the annual shareholder letter, Jamie noticed something unusual. A name buried in the risk disclosures. A familiar one. G.S. Staley. Once his protege, now the CEO of Barclays. And behind the scenes, whisper networks suggested that Staley had been lobbying regulators in Europe to tighten pressure on JPMorgan. Not as policy, out of rivalry. Jamie didn't flinch, but inside, he felt the burn. Loyalty, it seemed, had expiration dates. The student was now positioning himself as the heir to global banking dominance. Worse, he was aligning with hedge funds betting against JPMorgan's exposure. Jamie sat alone that evening, letter in hand, pen paused mid-sentence. "They all come back," he muttered. And they did. Not just in headlines but in strategy. The war was no longer with governments or markets. It was with his own reflection, those he'd shaped, trained, and perhaps underestimated. The betrayal struck a nerve Jamie rarely let anyone see. For years he had mentored men like G's, pushing them hard, forging steel through fire. But now their successes weren't reflections of his legacy, they were weapons pointed back at him. Late one night, Judith found Jamie standing in their darkened kitchen, drinking black coffee, staring at nothing. "It never ends," he said. "You build an empire, and then you defend it from your own." She didn't answer. She just put a hand on his shoulder and walked away. Jamie wasn't angry. He was recalibrating. The game had changed. It wasn't about domination anymore. It was about insulation, protection, control. Every move, every hire, every media whisper would now be orchestrated like symphony and counterattack. He'd learned this once before, when Sandy Weil turned. But this time, he wouldn't be caught by surprise. Weeks later, an unexpected headline hit. Dimon met with White House in private talks. The rumors ran wild. Treasury Secretary? Presidential advisor? But none of it was true. At least, not yet. Behind the closed doors of the West Wing, Jamie had warned the president's team. "You're not ready for what's coming. Global debt bubbles. European banks over-leveraged. Quiet collapse of consumer trust." Jamie wasn't lobbying, he was issuing prophecy. And for the first time, they listened. "What do you want?" a senior official asked. Jamie simply said, "To keep the country standing." It wasn't a grab for office. It was a recognition of what power really looked like, stability through influence. Not elected, entrenched. They could run governments. He could steady economies. And now, those circles overlap. He was no longer just a banker. He was a pillar of the republic. But even pillars cast shadows. Around this time, a former employee leaked an internal report. Hundreds of pages detailing quiet settlements, legal loopholes, and questionable alliances in overseas subsidiaries. The media pounced. JP Morgan's double game, the headline read. Jamie's lawyers begged silence. His PR team prepared statements. But Jamie did something else. He called the whistleblower. Alone. Tell me why, he asked. The voice on the line shook. Because you were supposed to be different. That night, Jamie didn't sleep. He paced. Reviewed everything. He'd always known there were trade-offs. Sacrifices. But now, the mask cracked. Was he still the man who once walked into Bank One with a mission? Or had the mission consumed him? The line between protector and predator had blurred. And maybe, just maybe, that was the point. You don't stay at the top without becoming part of the machine you swore to outplay. In the days after the leak, Jamie vanished from public view. Rumors flew, resignation, crisis, retreat. But inside JP Morgan, he was present. Every day. Quiet. Focused. He met with risk teams, compliance officers, and branch managers across the country. Clean everything, he ordered. Even the corners we've ignored. It wasn't fear, it was evolution. The machine he built needed oil, transparency, vigilance. This was no longer about outplaying the system. It was about outlasting it. And for the first time in decades, Jamie stopped chasing the next win. He turned inward. Not to rest, but to fortify. He wasn't done. But he was changed. The twist wasn't in the betrayal. It was in the realization that even titans have to rebuild, if only to survive what comes next. The 2020 pandemic hit like a tidal wave. Markets tanked overnight. Offices shuttered. Panic reigned. But Jamie didn't flinch. While CEOs disappeared into private bunkers, he called an emergency virtual town hall. We stay open, he said. We serve communities. It wasn't just optics, he meant it. JPMorgan branches remained operational. Loans were restructured. Small businesses were stabilized. And behind the scenes, Jamie worked through fevers and fatigue. COVID had reached him too. But he refused to stop. If we fold now, it's not just finance that collapses, it's trust. The virus tested every leader, every structure. And in those darkest hours, Dimon rose not as a banker, but as a symbol. His voice steady, his presence constant. For once, the world saw not the Wolf of Wall Street, but the Guardian. The man who wouldn't walk away. But beneath the heroism, fractures deepened. JPMorgan's internal culture cracked under pressure. Burnout soared. Mental health declined. A young associate collapsed during a 90-hour workweek. Jamie was briefed. Silence followed. Then, call the parents, take care of everything. It wasn't pearl, it was guilt. He had built a machine that demanded excellence, but at what human cost? That night, he walked the empty 40th floor alone, every fluorescent light buzzing like static. At his desk he stared at an old photo. Him young, fierce, hungry. And for the first time he asked himself, is that still me? Or just a ghost I keep feeding? He didn't cry. But he didn't speak either. He just sat there, surrounded by steel and silence, the empire humming softly beneath him. In a closed-door meeting with top executives, Jamie made an unexpected announcement. We're cutting hours, raising wages, rebalancing how we work. Silence. Then protests. That's not sustainable, one VP said. Jamie replied, neither is losing our people. This wasn't a pivot. It was a reckoning. He knew Wall Street thrived on brutal speed, but now it threatened the very engine that drove it. Jamie didn't care about applause. He cared about permanence. The future, he said, isn't just about returns. It's about resilience. For a man once defined by conquest, it was the boldest move yet, not to dominate, but to evolve. In that moment, he wasn't reacting to crisis. He was reshaping capitalism itself, on his own terms. But the cost of change drew blood. Investors rebelled. Media questioned his resolve. Dimon softens, one headline mocked. Stock prices dipped. Board members wavered. And in a tense meeting, one director said, "You're risking your legacy." Jamie leaned forward and answered, "This is my legacy." It wasn't defiance, it was clarity. The pressure was greater than ever. Whispers of retirement intensified. Succession planning ramped up. Rivals circled. But Jamie didn't flinch. Not because he couldn't feel the strain, but because he'd never been clearer. He didn't want a statue. He wanted a blueprint. Something that outlived him. Something that outlasted markets. In the storm of rejection, Jamie found something rare, his true north. Then came the annual shareholder meeting, Dimon's 17th. Cameras clicked. The room buzzed. Investors waited. He stepped to the podium, straightened his notes, and paused. This isn't just about profit, it's about people. A hush fell. He spoke not of numbers but of purpose. Equity. Sustainability. Stability. Some applauded. Others squirmed. But no one ignored him. Because Jamie Dimon, the man once feared as Wall Street's warlord, was now its philosopher king. Not everyone agreed with him. But everyone knew one truth: he wasn't pretending. As the room stood in applause, Jamie looked down, caught the reflection of himself in the podium glass, and smiled, not out of pride but peace. The fight wasn't over. But for once, it felt like he was no longer fighting himself. Dimon sat at his desk, staring at the latest financial report, his mind racing as the dust of the recent crisis began to settle. The recovery, though fragile, was beginning to take root. But there was still so much to be done. "We've managed to keep afloat, but the real challenge begins now," he thought, his gaze fixed on the numbers in front of him. His fingers drummed against the desk, an unconscious manifestation of the anxiety that still lingered beneath the surface. The media was beginning to turn their attention on him again, wondering if JPMorgan had truly weathered the storm, or if it was just a temporary respite. Dimon's mind kept returning to the same question: how much longer can we keep this up? His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Linda again, with the latest update. As he answered, he couldn't shake the feeling that the toughest part of this battle was yet to come. Dimon felt a growing unease as the days passed. While the markets had stabilized, the true scope of the damage was becoming clearer. JPMorgan had survived, but the damage to the global economy was more profound than he had anticipated. He sat in his office, staring out the window at the sprawling city below. What does the future hold? He wondered aloud. The weight of leadership was beginning to feel heavier than ever. I've seen this bank through the hardest times, but is this the beginning of something bigger? Are we really safe? His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. Linda stepped in, looking more worn than usual. "Jamie, we need to prepare for the next steps. There's still a lot of rebuilding to do." Dimon nodded, his mind already shifting into strategy mode. "You're right. Let's get to work." Days turned into weeks, and the pace of the recovery, though steady, felt agonizingly slow. Dimon spent long hours in his office, reviewing strategy plans and attending countless meetings with his senior team. The weight of the decisions he made grew heavier each day. "We've managed to keep the ship afloat, but now is about charting the course forward," he thought, staring at the projections in front of him. His phone rang once more, this time with an unfamiliar number. He hesitated, then picked up. "Jamie," the voice on the other end said, "the global situation is deteriorating. The recovery might not be as secure as we thought." Dimon's stomach dropped. "What do we need to do?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying the urgency of the moment. "We prepare for the worst," came the reply. Dimon set the phone down slowly, realizing that despite their efforts, the next challenge was already on the horizon. The next few days were a blur of meetings, decisions, and preparations. Dimon stood before his team, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. "We need to execute the contingency plans. If the market dips again, we won't have the luxury of time to react. We have to act now." His words were met with reluctant nods, the team understanding the gravity of what he was saying. Dimon had always been a calm and strategic leader, but the situation was becoming more dire by the hour. "We can't afford to make mistakes. Everything we've worked for is at risk," he said. There was a moment of silence in the room, the weight of the decision hanging heavily on everyone. Dimon turned to the screen, watching the market projections flicker before him. "Let's move, people. We don't have time to waste." By the time the week ended, Dimon found himself once again alone in his office, the phone calls and meetings finally over. But the relief was short-lived. The weight of his responsibility still hung heavily on his shoulders. "How many more times can we go through this?" he wondered, rubbing his temples. He stared out at the city, wondering how much longer the fragile recovery could hold. "We've done everything we can, but is it enough?" he thought. Dimon had never been one to second-guess himself, but in this moment, with everything on the line, he couldn't help but wonder if they were truly safe. His phone buzzed again. It was another update, but this time, Dimon didn't pick up. For the first time in days, he let the phone ring. He closed his eyes, leaning back in his chair, knowing that the hardest part of his journey might still be ahead. The recovery, though slow, had become a reality. Dimon sat in his office once more, reviewing the latest reports. The market had steadied, the company had survived, but the battle had taken its toll. "I did what I had to do," Dimon thought to himself, his mind replaying the decisions he had made. His phone buzzed with another update, more positive news, but it didn't bring the same relief it once did. "We've come through this, but at what cost?" Dimon muttered under his breath. He leaned back in his chair, staring out at the city below. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow across the skyline. "The storm is over for now, but the world has changed," he mused. His reflection in the window seemed to echo his thoughts, a man who had fought hard to protect what he had built, but was still haunted by the sacrifices made along the way. Dimon didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure: survival had come at a steep price. The weight of the last few months had left Dimon more reflective than he had ever been. As he walked through the halls of JPMorgan's headquarters, he was met with the usual flurry of activity: phone calls, meetings, urgent decisions. But this time, it felt different. The sense of urgency had lessened, but it was replaced by something else. A quiet tension, a recognition that the world had irrevocably shifted. What's next? Dimon wondered. The bank had survived, yes, but the global economy was forever altered. We've built something strong, but is it enough for what's to come? His steps echoed in the quiet halls, a man who had been through the fire, but was now unsure of the path ahead. It's never over, is it? He thought, reflecting on the fact that leadership in times like these was never a victory, only a momentary reprieve. Dimon sat in his private office, looking over a letter. It was a note of thanks from the government, acknowledging JPMorgan's role in stabilizing the financial system. We didn't do this alone, Dimon thought as he read through it, a faint smile crossing his lips. But we were the ones who stepped up when it mattered. The weight of the past few months had aged him, but he could sense a shift in himself as well. The crisis had revealed his strength, but it had also revealed his vulnerabilities. You can't fight every battle by yourself, he whispered. The journey wasn't over. There were still plenty of challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long time, Dimon felt like he could breathe a little easier. The battle for survival had been won, but now it was time to rebuild. And rebuild he would. But this time, with the understanding that the world had changed, and so had he. Dimon met with his senior team one last time to discuss the next steps. The worst is behind us, he said, his voice steady but tinged with the exhaustion of the past months. But the real work begins now. We rebuild, we reimagine, we move forward. His team listened attentively, nodding in agreement. The tension that had once filled the room had dissipated, replaced by a shared sense of purpose. We didn't just survive, Dimon continued, looking each of them in the eye. We proved that we can endure, and we will continue to prove it every day. He stood, walking to the window. The financial system will never be the same, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. We can adapt. We can lead. His voice was resolute, a leader not only surviving the storm, but ready to take on whatever came next. He turned back to the room, a quiet smile forming on his lips. Let's get to work. As Dimon sat in his office late into the night, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The crisis had been brutal, but it had also revealed something important: his ability to lead through chaos, his ability to endure when others falter. I've led JPMorgan through storms before, but this one was different, he thought, running a hand through his hair. The markets had stabilized, but Dimon knew the real test was ahead. We've built something strong, but it's fragile. We must remain vigilant, always. His phone buzzed one last time that night. Another update. Another report. But Dimon didn't pick it up. Instead, he sat back in his chair, allowing himself a moment of peace. He had made it through the worst. And though the future was uncertain, Dimon knew he had earned the right to face whatever came next.